Hello all and welcome to RiskScout's final webinar of the year, BSA Unwrapped. We are so excited to have you joining us here today. Now, before we dive into today's webinar content, we'd like to roll through some quick housekeeping items. RiskScout will be sharing all of today's webinar resources, including the slides, the handouts, and today's recording in a follow-up email, so be sure to keep an eye on your inbox. We also want this session to be as valuable for you as possible, so we encourage you to ask any questions that you may have throughout today's session in the questions section of the webinar panel on the side of your screen. We'll also be running a few poll questions throughout the webinar today to better understand you, our audience, so your participation is greatly appreciated. Now, in case it is your first time joining us, RiskScout is a team of former bank examiners, BSA professionals, and fintech developers helping financial institutions grow and be more efficient and profitable. Through a full BSA AML suite and specialized market tools, RiskScout's solution increase revenue and decrease your compliance burden by unlocking new deposit streams and automating compliance workflows. We are funded and influenced by over 200 financial institutions through networks like Castle Creek, the Bankers Helping Bankers Fund, and Alloy Labs, and we're proud that 100% of our customers are referenceable. If you're interested in learning more about how we help community banks and credit unions every single day, visit RiskScout.com and get in touch. RiskScout recently announced a brand new comprehensive BSA AML solution. Our team has been working tirelessly to develop innovative and intuitive ways to solve common industry challenges in the realms of risk scoring, transaction monitoring, onboarding and due diligence, SAR and CTR filing, case and investigation management, and more. And I'm excited that we are officially ready to share this exciting solution with community banks and credit unions. If you would like to join us in taking the BS out of BSA, you can request a demo at RiskScout.com or answer the demo question in the survey following this webinar session. Today's webinar will be led by Kristen Parker, RiskScout's Vice President of Compliance and Operations, and Ryan McInerney, RiskScout's Vice President of Product Strategy. Kristen is a seasoned expert in BSA AML and fraud prevention with extensive experience building and implementing monitoring programs for higher risk industries. She has contributed to significant updates in the FFIEC manual, provided practical risk-based AML guidance at industry events, and played a role in the development of RiskScout's innovative actionable BSA solutions. Recognized by her peers as PBC's Compliance Person of the Year, Kristen continues to champion efficient, technology-driven approaches that empower financial institutions to confidently manage regulatory requirements. Ryan leverages his extensive regulatory and technical background to create software solutions that solve critical industry problems. Before joining RiskScout, Ryan served as a national bank examiner at the OCC, where he was a key member of the Northeast District Committees for Compliance and Commercial Credit, working to address challenges facing community banks. We are very excited to have both of these experts here joining us today. And without further ado, I will go ahead and pass the baton over to Kristen to set the stage and dive into today's content. Take it away, Kristen.
Thank you, Ethan. Pleasure as always. Ryan, I'm my confidant, my partner in crime over here at RiskScout. We have always enjoyed doing webinars together, and it's been a minute since we did one together. So I'm excited to walk through 2024 Unwrapped with you, kind of looking at what's happened over the last year, because God knows it's been a long year. I like to tell people it's been the longest yet shortest year of my whole life. And then I know I'm not the only one that feels that way, but I think it's also good that we're taking a moment to look ahead of what people should be kind of anticipating for next year. Of course, I think we have a little bit of a wild card going on for 2025. You never know what's going to be thrown at you, but all that said, we're going to start with talking through the enforcement actions of 2024. We're going to look at new regulations, emerging trends, and then we're going to really take a look into what is in the works for 2025, what's kind of 2024 has set the stage for.
Excellent. And that will bring us to our first poll question. We'd love to get a little icebreaker out and get our audience engaged. Since this is a webinar that is based on Spotify Wrapped, we wanted to get your opinion on what you thought about this year's Spotify Wrapped. You can select any of those options that are on your screen now, anything from you loved it, maybe it was just fine, maybe you're not quite a fan, maybe you're not a Spotify user, but you do enjoy seeing everyone post theirs or all those data visualization. And maybe you're just one of those folks saying, hey, hold on a minute, what is Spotify Wrapped? Go ahead and get your answers in. We'll get a little bit warmed up here today, and we'll throw it back over to our presenters. Excellent. Thanks, y'all, for getting those responses in pretty quick. Let's turn those results around and see what we had. You know, with a pretty mixed review on the actual rollout of Spotify Wrapped, which is not to be too surprising. I know some people had strong opinions on the design, things like that. But I do think it's interesting that 55% of our audience says, what is Spotify Wrapped? Ryan, I know you're a big music guy. Can you take a second and give us a high-level synopsis on what we're actually spinning off here? What are we talking about?
Definitely. I mean, usually you ask me at the end of every poll, do the results surprise me? And those surprise me. But Spotify Wrapped is, so for anyone that's using Spotify, the listening you had over the prior year, they take your most played songs, your most played artists, and they give you the summary of that and say, this was your most popular song, this was your most popular artist, here's how much time you wasted listening to music. So every year everyone gets that information and people start comparing notes back and forth. Great way to get engagement out of their users.
That's right. That's right. Thank you for that. We do actually have a little example of what, you know, RiskScout Spotify Wrapped might have looked like. Kristen, I'll let you speak to this a little bit.
Yeah, you know, we're all about BSA compliance over here. So naturally, we would be drawn to songs that are based around what we do for work, right? So just a little bit of fun here with a couple of, you know, big hits, oldies but goodies, right? All right. I think it's time.
Excellent.
Yeah, so Ethan, you taking us through right into another poll question. I love that.
That's right. That's right. So before we dive into our enforcement actions, we want to first ask y'all, what was your most significant BSA AML challenge? And you can choose between any of the following. We know there were only 5 options, which makes it maybe a little bit tough to choose. That can be anything from fraud detection, managing high-risk customers, keeping up with the regulatory changes. Boy, there were a couple of them. Maybe staffing or software challenges. We know a lot of times those go hand in hand. And then finally, exams and audits. We know that's always a common one. So we go just a couple more seconds to get in here. Excellent. Ooh, this is interesting. Seems like we're pretty evenly split as these results are rolling in. Let's go ahead and close that out and turn these results around. Ryan, you know what I'm going to ask you. I am going to throw this question your way. It looks like we have almost roughly 1/3 split across fraud detection, keeping up with regulatory changes, staffing, or software changes. So pretty evenly tied at the top. At the bottom, we have exams and audits, followed by our least most common choice, which is managing high-risk customers. Ryan, is this surprising to you?
This one makes way more sense to me. I mean, when we're thinking about fraud, I feel like we've had a lot of conversations with financial institutions over the year where they're talking about the issues they're seeing with checks or anything like that. And some of the stuff that you thought was kind of in the past is making a resurgence there. And then in terms of just keeping up with all of the different regulatory actions that are happening, I mean, we've seen a ton of enforcement actions this year. We've seen changing regulations throughout that. And so just trying to keep your finger on the pulse there and say, okay, I need to do this, I need to change that. Might need to hire somebody new, but how do I find someone that's skilled or already knows what's going on at the bank or the credit union? It's a lot of moving pieces. So those ones all make sense.
Excellent. Well, thank you all again for sharing your responses there. Let's dive into the numbers behind some of these enforcement actions. I'll throw it back over to y'all.
Guys, I think this was probably the most enforcement actions we've ever seen in a single year. So this chart only goes through Q3. So October, end of September, beginning of October was when this one was released. We had 48 severe enforcement actions by the end of September, which surpasses the total of 43 from 2023 altogether. It does not come as a surprise to me that this has occurred, because what we're hearing a lot from the regulatory agencies is it's not business as usual, right? Your BSA program, your BSA AML program, it doesn't matter the size of your institution, you have got to have that under control. And over the past year, sometime in the spring to summertime, we at RiskScout participated in the ICBA's Think Tech Accelerator. And during that time frame, we talked to probably a little over 100 banks during that time frame, all different sizes, traditionally $1 billion and below, who were saying it was such a different exam cycle this year than they've ever experienced ever before. So just because you've had the same program forever and ever and ever, doesn't mean that when you go for your next exam, you're going to get that same love and feedback you've gotten historically, because the risks have changed and evolved, and they only continue to do that rapidly and more intensely as technology changes, as how we're offering banking services has changes, how money moves quicker, right? We've got to be able to defend and understand from a risk-based approach why we have chosen to design our program the way we have, so we can ensure that it really does detect and deter suspicious activity for our institution. This is just something that I don't think is isolated to 2024. I think we're headed for a 2025 that it's going to get even harder in this space. We know that the institution size of what happened with these fines went all the way from $25 million in assets. That's small for an institution to, your TD banks of the world that exist out there. Ryan, you want to add anything from the regulatory perspective? It's always interesting for me to hear kind of your take on these things as a former OCC regulator.
Yeah, I'd say when you look at these enforcement actions, right, these are just the regulatory actions that were so significant and took time and actually got published. This doesn't account for, say, all the MRAs that aren't coming forward to our eyes, and actually knowing that those are happening. There's going to be a lot more MRAs than enforcement actions. So when you look at, say, maybe some of the issues that are happening at community banks, there could be a lot more in these different areas. They just don't rise to the level of requiring a fine or requiring basically a court order to get the bank to go make that change and fix it. So keep in mind that you can work with your regulators on this stuff, whether that's a recommendation or an MRA, to avoid getting to this point. I think it's much more preferable to kind of take care of this before it reaches the public light.
I think it's a good time for you to kind of bust the myth that your regulators are there just to try to pick everything apart and get you in trouble. They really want to be partners with you throughout the year, like an ongoing conversation, and utilizing them for what they've seen, because the best relationships I had with my examiners are the ones that I was deeply involved with and kept them abreast of what we were doing and running by my mitigation efforts by them, regardless if I'd put them in place or not yet, just trying to get their opinion.
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be some individuals, regardless of the place they work, that are a little, let's go with the word cantankerous. But even when you engage with them, I saw even those types of people were more kind of forgiving and able to work with a financial institution, rather than like if something was totally out of their line of sight and then a year later they come back and the bank or the credit union to say, all this stuff has changed, I had no idea this was going on, and they kind of like freak out about it. So keeping them informed kind of makes it a little bit easier for them to take in the changes that you're making and to actually work with you rather than against you.
I once had an institution that went to their regulator and said, we're going to start a cannabis banking program. They said, great, you've checked all the boxes that you need to check, thinking through. They said, what's your projected size? They said, less than 20. Okay, they came in, the regulator came in the next year and they had 400 clients. And that exam did not go very well. It was caused a lot of tension. They didn't have the right resources there to help kind of go through that. The examiner it just set the wrong tone. So keeping them as best informed as you can. giving them a heads up of things is really a good way to kind of help get ahead of these examiner woes that are happening quite egregiously.
Yeah.
Over the
And
year.
last thing I'd say there too is at the beginning of every year, the regulatory agencies put out their priorities for the upcoming year. So if you want a sneak preview at what they're probably going to be hammering down on the most, that's going to be identified in those priorities. And over the past few years, those priorities have really been on third-party risk management, which kind of bleeds into fintech management, partner management. BSA AML has been huge on there for kind of right-sizing the amount of monitoring and risk management you have over different types of customers. I think those two have been really the biggest. And then a lot of IT cybersecurity has been super important.
Those are great call outs and excellent advice as always. We did have a question come in that I'd like to throw y'all's way before we move on here. I might ask you to Babe Ruth it a little bit and give your point to the outfield, but we had a question asking what you think the number of total enforcement actions will be by the end of 2025, this time next year. And if that is too on the nose to call that ball, maybe we can just make an estimation of, do we think it will be higher? Do we think it will be lower? Do we have any guesses?
I'll pick a number, but it won't be right. I'd imagine it's going to be probably pretty similar to 2024, maybe a little bit lower. But if there's changes in, say, like if the economy changes or anything like that, you'll see more enforcement actions that might be coming in on like liquidity risk management or like credit risk management. So it's really going to depend on what the economy does as well as what the regulatory priorities are. But I'd say probably a similar amount.
I could probably agree with that, similar or just slightly higher. I think that some institutions are like on a 12, 18-month cycle, so they haven't necessarily been through their annual exam, especially obviously if they're in an 18-month cycle, they may have not gone through their exam this year, which leaves them up for either extra time to clean up their act or extra time to get more in trouble for when the examiner comes in. So, you know, it's a gamble.
Yeah. Because I mean, even when you look at these, it's not like these pop up overnight. Every time that was part of enforcement action with the OCC, that we'd been working with that institution for years, probably on that same issue. And it was just repeated kind of non-compliance with what we would have expected to get to that point.
Yeah, that just blows my mind. It's just not my nature to let things sit like that. But I get it. It could. Everybody has their strengths and their weaknesses. In some institutions, it just takes longer to clean up certain things. Also takes, what's the effort of management going to be involved in it too, right? So
yeah,
really when we talk about who's safe and who's not, you know, I think it goes back to a saying that the smallest asset size to get an enforcement action this year was 23.8 million in assets. That's so small. That's smaller than, I would say they probably have 20 or less employees in that institution for them, if at best, right? And then the largest goes to Wells Fargo, and really TD Bank's up there as well. But it just shows that it doesn't matter the asset side. You're getting scrutinized. Chesterfield, they were scrutinized over poor risk assessments, inadequate monitoring of high risk customers. They should have had them flagged better. And then insufficient staff training was a huge one. So we've done webinars in the past about training and what's adequate for training. And you know, when you're ultimately your BSA AML program is up to your board of directors, right? They hold the ultimate responsibility. If they're only getting, they probably have no idea what BSA AML stands for the most part. Board members are not somebody who's been in banking a lot of the times, or if they have, it's been in a different field outside of compliance. So a lot of times what we end up seeing is these institutions given this canned BSA training that works if you've had a more thorough training in the past, and then this serves as a refresher, but just small 20-minute training on BSA when it's such an important subject, obviously, given all the enforcement actions, is not adequate. We're seeing more examiners come down on that component on it. Fintech partnerships are where people ended up getting in big trouble this year because they ended up with many inadequacies in how they monitor those relationships. And I think the ultimate lesson that should be learned from that, and I'd love for you to add a little color to it, Ryan, is that your fintech customers are your customers, right? You're ultimately responsible for that monitoring and detection and reporting of suspicious activity that could happen at that fintech. So you can't just put all the ownership on that fintech unless you have some oversight over that to ensure they are doing what they say they are doing. That's where most of those enforcement actions came.
Yeah, and I mean, we've done whole sessions on that in the past, which is just how do you monitor a fintech? How do you monitor a partner to make sure you understand the risk in their portfolio, understand the customers or members they're taking on? Really, I mean, it all comes down to transparency. Do you know the risk that your financial institution is taking, and do you have the ability to monitor it? There's what is it? Measure, monitor, mitigate. Those are kind of all the words you're hearing out of your regulators, probably. At least that's what we used to say all the time. And that's the same thing that really was prevalent with a lot of the issues we saw this year.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out the fact that a lot of times when the fintech craze started happening, we would have a lot of conversations at RiskScout with smaller institutions who thought it was going to be an easy way for them to have, good fee income, good stable deposits, all of that, without realizing the burden of what it was going to take to actually run that from a monitoring and BSA regulatory requirement perspective. And it just goes to show that you really, as a BSA professional, need to have a seat at the table for the strategic conversations that are happening, because you need to educate yourself on what that's going to take from a BSA perspective and make sure you have that in writing and help them understand what the risks are and what it's going to take from a person, technology, or both of that perspective to actually adequately run a program like that that's not going to have regulatory scrutiny over it. But if you're just somebody who doesn't have a voice at the table for either understanding what the strategic plan is for the institution, or you just don't have enough political capital at your institution to be heard, you're setting yourself up for potentially a really, really hard regulatory life, right?
Yeah, yep, definitely. And one conversation we've had a lot of different times is just kind of understanding the relationship that you would have with a fintech partner. A lot of times I feel like we've talked with a lot of different vendors where they say, oh yeah, they just hit our API, they give us this information that way. And for partners that haven't really worked with financial institutions as much and may have worked in the financial services space, but more from a technology side, kind of expect all of the banks and the credit unions just be able to kind of start right up and give them all the information they need and the way that they want it. And a lot of times you really want a partner that understands your information, understands how your information is stored in maybe your core, maybe in some non-traditional ways from the technology world, and just level setting on all of that and saying, which information can I get to you? This is where it is, can you get it? But before you engage in anything, just making sure that that is really clear, and that you're going to have the information you need and they're going to have the information they need.
Yep.
That's a whole webinar in itself, but.
All right, the FinCEN CDD final rule, that was something that went into effect in January of this year. Now we'll put a little asterisk beside that because within the last 2 weeks, a Texas judge blocked the requirement for now. Like there's an injunction on it, so anybody who hasn't filed yet has been told to stop filing with FinCEN. But that all said, for the most part of this year, we've had to really dive deep and understand what this meant from an institutional perspective, right? Anything to add, Ryan, on there?
Well, I mean, congratulations for anyone that didn't file and had to. But we'll see kind of what changes with any of that. Regardless of kind of those changes because of the injunction, we still have the same BOI requirements as a financial institution in terms of understanding who the account belongs to and gathering that information. I think a lot of us would probably say that's a duplication of effort, but we're still kind of stuck in the same holding pattern where financial institutions are really taking that intermediary role to understand who owns this company and storing that information yourselves. So just continue to keep up that work there.
Yeah, and I just don't, there wasn't anything completely dramatic that changed from an institutional burden, right? There's adjustments that should be expected in the future after, if it even stays as a rule. I think you're going to see where there were talks of, well, the institution in whatever cases will have access to the portal in which this information is stored on behalf of these businesses within FinCEN and be able to search it under certain circumstances. But in order to do that, you had to get permission from X, Y, and Z. And it just is going to be so cumbersome and so complex to actually ever put into action. It will be curious to see what extra steps institutions have to be doing and what will our regulators expect from that side of things once this is all officially ironed out. I think we're going to have hiccups in it for quite a while before it's actually determined whether or not it's an effective tool or not.
Yeah, and I'm really more interested in the next few years on this one. Kind of how does this start to change and alleviate burden from financial institutions, hopefully. But right now, just looking over the horizon, I don't really see anything providing too much relief.
All that to be said is just don't be scared. Just keep business as usual until you're told differently, right? And we'll tell you when something changes. If you sign up for our newsletter, you'll be the first one to know, right? If there's been a change there, you should be aware of. But stick with how you've been doing beneficial ownership for now, and I feel like you're in good shape.
Yep.
Okay, so part of the SAR and CTR modernization conversation comes from the fact that there was a law that was passed several years ago that part of that law meant updating and understanding potentially the SAR and CTR thresholds, right? What do we report on? How do we report it? What improvements can be seen there so that they are more effective? Will we have a global information sharing pilot program, kind of similar to how FinCEN, the data feeds in from current SARs to FinCEN and then gets distributed out, and then those law enforcement agencies can get in to the FinCEN portal and look through SARs and sift through SARs that may be relevant for whatever their priorities are at the moment. Making that a little bit easier was part of that. There is an ongoing review of CTR effectiveness. Is the reporting threshold too little? There's all sorts of conversations and articles written about that, about, no, it isn't, because you do $10,000 at multiple banks, that adds up to be a lot of money, or no, $10,000 in today's time frame, it's chump change for the most part with how expensive everything is. So it'll be interesting to see what ends up coming out of those types of reporting threshold changes potentially. It will be interesting to see if from a pilot program perspective, if law enforcement, what their feedback is for that, to say, is it more effective? Pilot programs are give and take on whether or not they ever actually really get taken off. And if you're dealing with the government, things can take a little bit longer too. So it may take years before we find out the effectiveness of that. But really, by the end of 2025, FinCEN is really hoping to have evaluated and have enough information from the CTR perspective, threshold perspective, to anticipate maybe changes to those thresholds and how we report on CTRs going forward into 2026. Anything to add, Ryan?
Well, I mean, it's funny that you say it typically takes a little bit of time from anything government-wise, because when this act was put forward, I think it was finally passed through in 2021. The review was supposed to take a year. So it's AML Act of 2020, and then passed 2021. Then this review is supposed to be done in 2022. And here we are in 2024. They're like, well, we'll finish it at the end of 2025. But it will be, I think it'll be interesting to see how they start to look at these thresholds a little bit and where those will change. Just with inflation and all the different changes we've seen over the past few decades, it's kind of crazy to think that threshold wouldn't need to be revised. And if you talk to different individuals in law enforcement that might be in different offices, whether that's like Miami or other kind of high volume areas, they aren't even looking at any of this stuff unless it's over, say, like $1 million in aggregate or a few $1 million in aggregate. So there's a disconnect certainly in the amount of reporting that we're all doing. And there's probably a happy middle ground, but you do still want to understand what were all those smaller ones that started to add up. So it'll be interesting.
We did a webinar earlier this year, which was my favorite webinar we did all year, which was called Star Wars Law Enforcement Awakens. And you can find it on YouTube, but it walks you through what law enforcement goes through once your SAR is submitted to them, and then how you can collaborate better with law enforcement going forward, because we know at smaller institutions, the likelihood of you even in a singular SAR filing or a successive reoccurring SAR filing sequence ever going to reach $1 million is probably very slim to none, right? But that doesn't mean that what you're doing is ineffective.
Mm-hmm.
If you're filing on $5,000, doesn't mean that what you're doing is ineffective. They might not proactively go out and search their threshold for it, but they will, if you have a conversation with them and you have collaborations with them, and they understand that when you reach out to them based on something you have seen that is potentially suspicious or egregious, or you have a gut feeling about, you've notified them after you filed your SAR about it, they're going to start looking for your SARs more often, right? And so it doesn't matter the threshold of what it is. And then you have that collaboration. So you're not crying wolf, but you're actually saying, hey, I see patterns of human trafficking here, or elder financial abuse in certain situations, or yada, yada, yada. So, that $1 million number is important at a higher level, but when you go down and you break down to how you can really be effective in your role from a collaborative point with law enforcement, doesn't matter the amount of your SAR that you're filing. So I think there's just multi-layered cake here essentially, right? Of like, if you peel back the layers, effectiveness goes more than just the dollar amount you're filing at. It's also including the amount of effort you put into your narrative to make an effective narrative, the effort you put into your law enforcement collaboration, so on and so forth. So if you're interested in that, I would encourage you to go back and listen to that SAR, because that SAR Wars webinar, because it's really, really interesting, from kind of helping you be more of a better detective for your institution.
Yeah.
All right, so staying ahead of bad actors, the emerging tech regulations that are coming out. There's a lot of in the proposed notice of proposed rulemaking that was happening throughout this past year on AML updates, had a big focus on risk-based AML programs. In that proposed rulemaking, you would be required to actually do a risk assessment. Right now, it's just suggested, right? And every time I've talked to an institution who has not done a risk assessment and has gone through their exams in the past, they are highly encouraged to do so, but never really written up for it, right? Because it's not actually a requirement to do so. So that would become a requirement. When we talk about emerging technologies, we want to be understanding of the fact that emerging technologies like AI or machine learning to detect suspicious activities, they are being encouraged, right? Use the tools that are out there, but the traditional problem with the big buzzword of AI or machine learning is the glass box, black box issue, right? If you can't understand why your system that you're using to help you find suspicious activity, you can't understand why it's making the decisions it is, because you're looking into a black box where the AI is doing its thing and it doesn't tell you how it's concluding its decision, then that's where the regulators are going to have issue with, right, Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, we've been talking about that. I think when I joined the OCC, and that was like 10, 11 years ago, we were having that conversation about black box versus glass box. I was like, okay, well, what's actually happening in there? How are they getting these transaction alerts? Are they accurate? What are they actually thinking about? And all of the kind of evaluation that you saw for the next 5, 6, 7, 10 years, whatever it might be, has all kind of pointed towards wanting a risk-based program. If you read any of the BSA guidance, it's talking about developing procedures that are appropriate for the risk profile of the customer or the member. And so when you start to see a lot of these enforcement actions and regulatory actions that are coming to the BSA space, it shouldn't be a surprise based on what was kind of requested in the past, and then given the tools that a lot of us are offered now in terms of how to manage our program, because the tool might not give you the ability to break down into different portfolios of customers or members, or you might not have analytics talent on your team that can help you start to kind of do some of that exploratory analysis. So really that risk-based piece is huge. And then in terms of preparing for AI, when we just think about like if there are different types of AI you might be implementing, there's different types for that. So there's the one you see in the news all the time, which is just kind of like this autonomous monstrosity that's going to turn into Terminator. It's making its own decisions, and it's like building a car in the garage. That's probably not the AI you'd be using in your institution. What you probably would be using is something that really borders more on kind of like high-end statistics, which is really like machine learning or cluster analysis, where you start to figure out these customers behave this way together. And so I can market to that group because they have similar characteristics. Or I've run pattern analysis here, and I see these types of customers when they have this activity are going to leave my financial institution. So you could have, say, a marketing campaign around that. And then similarly, as you start to see those behaviors, you can apply different patterns in anti-money laundering, anti-fraud. All of that kind of comes down to data. And so just making sure your data is working well and you understand what it's doing, you understand your transaction codes, all that sort of fun stuff. And then you can play with all this fun stuff. I'm going off on a giant tangent.
No, it's all good. Yeah, so we just mentioned the notice of proposed rulemaking. Again, it'll make the risk assessment process mandatory, which if you're not doing a risk assessment, how do you know what's even going on at your institution? Like that's, if you want to talk about really being able to mitigate true risks that you know that are happening at your institution, your risk assessment should be something that's thorough, that should not be done just once a year at time of scrambling right before your examiners come in. There should be a method to the madness here. It should be a working document that you are constantly revising and understanding as you understand your bank's or credit union's strategic risk or strategic planning that they're doing, what products and services they're offering. Are they expanding the footprint? If they're not expanding by brick and mortar, are they expanding digitally? If they add a fintech, who are they serving? What are the regulatory requirements for the products and services they're offering? You know, and you know, we could have a whole webinar just on a thorough risk assessment, which we probably should do at some point. But it's important to remember that it's just not a check the box action. And when it becomes a requirement, if it becomes a requirement, which is likely going to happen, you better be prepared to actually have one that is thorough and useful. We've got one on our website you can download, but you know, if you ever need any type of advice on a risk assessment or a document to work through, you can always reach out to me too, because I mean, I have a love-hate relationship with risk assessments. They're so painful to do to some extent, but there's never a better story that can be told than a risk assessment at your institution, right? One that's actually useful, a useful, usable risk assessment.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Brian.
I was gonna add, there was a training we did on this years ago. I think it was the Community Bankers Association in California. And we're talking about taking these risk assessments, and when you kind of bring it up to the enterprise level, if you have, say, like your BSA compliance risk assessment, you have credit, you have kind of all these different people coming together, there's a lot of insights that you can share through these, because you can show a summary of what's really happening in your department, what the composition is of your portfolios and why that's important. And that can be really relevant, not only from a risk management perspective on the back end, but it can be also very relevant for kind of money-making opportunities, cross-selling, trying to figure out what type of areas we want to target or where you all might feel comfortable targeting something else or not. But bringing these up to more of an executive level can be really informative for all the other parties involved and gives you guys a little bit more kind of swing and say in how some of those strategies are going to be executed.
Yeah.
So before we move on here, we had a question come in that I thought was a pretty interesting one. It said, for most institutions, I assume, are already doing risk assessments and have risk-based programs in place. So how much of a change is this really?
Oh, so it's never safe to assume that most are doing that, because at a lot of smaller institutions, when your BSA officer is also your OFAC officer, your security officer, your IT officer, and all these things, BSA could be 10 to 25% of what they're doing, and they don't do it any more than they have to. And if they don't have to do a risk assessment, they don't. So it's really what you're going to end up seeing. The feedback I've been getting when I talk to different regulators is if you're already taking a risk-based approach and you're already doing a risk assessment in that, and you feel good about it, and you've really been thorough in your risk assessment, then nothing's going to change for you, except somebody's going to actually read your risk assessment thoroughly and kind of help steer the conversation of how the exam goes from there. Anything else to add, Ryan?
I'd say I agree with everything you said there. And then adding in on the risk-based part, I think sometimes we say that word and we don't actually act on it. And so when you think of like how much you can do and sort of segmenting your portfolios or really being expressly specific in how you want to manage this type of customer or member versus this type based on their risk, a lot of times that isn't as detailed as you think it is. And so if it already is a detailed kind of very specific program, then that's great. Sometimes that's just it's probably gonna need to be enhanced a little bit if some of these changes happen.
That's great. Thank you for those answers. I'll also add on here, in that second sub-bullet, we talk about the AML priorities. I know Ryan's already alluded to them a little bit. They come out every year. And a lot of times they have maybe niche items like domestic terrorism or environmental hazards or things like that a lot of banks don't have incorporated into their programs. And this, of course, if this rule is passed, that might change. So definitely something that we can all keep a little bit more focus on these priorities, since potentially they might have to be incorporated into a program. So thank you all for answering that quick question. We do actually, I believe, roll into a poll question here, and we want to know a little bit more about how you have been involved in your financial institution's 2025 strategic planning. So that can be everything from I'm very involved, maybe you're working directly with the board, other departments, collaborating there. Maybe you're just somewhat involved. Maybe you're not involved at all. Maybe you haven't even started 2025. Listen, we still got 21 days. There's still time left in the year. Or maybe, hopefully not, but I'm sure we might have some folks that are in the, wait, you guys have a plan category? So we'll give you all just a couple more seconds to get your responses in, and we'll see how it stacks up. Excellent. Well, these results are looking favorable, so that's always good to see. We can turn these around and show that 14% of our audience considers themselves very involved. The majority of the folks on the call today say they're somewhat involved, which I think is pretty typical from what we see a lot. 31% say that they are not at all involved. Only 3% have not started yet. Kristen, let me throw this one over to you. How does this stack up to what you're expecting to see?
I mean, the not all involved, I wish that was a surprise, but it's not, because I've been in BSA officer a lot of my career. I understand that at different institutions, you have different level of respect and involvement. You almost have to butt your way into the conversation sometimes at some institutions and say, no, I have a voice here. I need to understand this, but you can do that in an educated and professional manner, right? There's ways to have those conversations. I like that there's more of a percentage of somewhat involved, because that's better than not involved at all. But I get that some things are sensitive, some things are confidential when it comes to strategic plan that we became aware of, but you need to at least set some expectations of what is the minimal things that you should be made aware of, right? Product changes, footprint changes, those types of things. Well, we talked on this a little bit earlier, but just to reiterate and let you guys, make sure you're aware of, is that there's not really been any changes from the FI perspective for the BOI rule, but right now nobody has to do anything because it's currently stuck in an injunction. Whew, man, the things we talked about this year, I've talked about a million things BSA this year, but a lot of what we talked about was fraud. We talked a lot about fraud, and it was such a hot topic because fraud has just been rearing its ugly head. And I thought sometime in the summer when I was taking my kid to school, or right at the end of the school year, I was like, I can't believe I'm still talking about check fraud, and in 2024, I'm still putting this much thought effort into it. Just everything goes in a cycle, it seems, with fraud. A lot of conversations we had this year with institutions who were looking to, have a better solution for their BSA, always wanted to talk about the topic of real-time fraud monitoring. And I wanted to touch on this for a minute because I think there is just a little bit of a myth about what real-time actually means, right? There is no actual real-time fraud monitoring that exists out there. There are more proactive fraud monitorings that happen by stopping a transaction before it goes out, but that doesn't necessarily happen within real time to an extent, right? So these institutions that want real-time fraud monitoring don't understand a lot of times that real-time fraud monitoring means it's simply just delayed fraud monitoring. So it may be that you're just doing a little bit more same day instead of next day reviews of transactions. But if you do have a tool in your pocket that has some type of real fraud, more instead of overnight fraud monitoring, has more day of alert decisioning monitoring, it does take staffing to do that. And what a lot of times people don't wrap their heads around is if you have something that's more real-time decisioning tools, it takes real-time decisions from people. And at most community financial institutions, the staffing is not there to do that. So there are different ways to tackle fraud more proactively with the right tools in your pocket, but don't get spoofed by the idea that something is, that real time is truly something you need at your institution, and something that even really truly exists today. Ryan, anything else to add there?
No, I think that's a really good point. Some of the other things to think of there, a lot of these solutions are only going to be as fast as you can provide data to them. So if you're looking at any real-time fraud solutions, just make sure the data that you're providing to them can be provided in a near real-time fashion.
Yeah, and you guys have to remember, a lot of the cores you're working with don't even have that capability built out yet, right? We've talked to cores all the time just because we're deeply involved with a lot of the cores out there, and they'll be the first to tell you that we don't have the capability to do that yet to provide you. So just be aware, have smart conversations like that, be educated when it comes to that. Just know that you might not even need it for your scenario, right? You just don't get caught in the buzzwords. Economic pressures, rising interest rates and inflation will change. Ryan, you touched on that in the beginning, right? Where you said that will bring different potential issues for institutions based on liquidity risks.
Yeah, liquidity, sensitivity, earnings. I mean, everything gets affected when we see changes in rates. So I mean, it could be rate changes, it could be changes in delinquencies. Just based on how the year shakes out, you could see a lot of different effects from what happens economically. But watching the rates, I think, is the safest bet.
Yeah. The risk-based due diligence, that's what we heard over every enforcement action we read. It was a lot of times based around due diligence. right? You didn't have the right proper monitoring. You didn't even do the right due diligence when you onboarded them. And then once you did onboard them, you didn't monitor them properly. So that seems to be a reoccurring theme in most of the enforcement actions. The staffing challenges, that's been a top problem for years. And I would say since COVID, 2020 on, and it's only gotten worse with staffing shortages, not being able to find qualified people. Seeing a lot of people go back to just having people with cheeks in the seats all day long, will not hire people remotely. So because they're in a remote area that they don't have experienced people, they're just letting the teller draw the short straw and become the BSA officer, and they're learning the job on the whim. And it's tough. It's tough out there. And you can't do that if you're wanting to bank fintechs and different more regulatory burden type customers, right? So this is a common problem, budget being a huge component, but a lot of times we understand too that the cost of compliance may seem expensive to some people, but the cost of non-compliance is way more expensive in the long run.
And on that that risk-based due diligence piece, that's really what I was referencing before, because I mean, CDD, EDD, those are already requirements, but they just might not be something that's really well developed. And so when you start getting regulators coming to the bank or the credit union, and they say, okay, well, how well do you really know your customers to segment them to be risk-based? I think there's just going to be a little bit more scrutiny about that understanding of what your customer member actually is and whether or not you're putting them into the appropriate monitoring or oversight buckets.
Here's what we've learned in 2024. Size doesn't matter. It really doesn't. The enforcement actions are all over the place. So you just need, you might have to lose a little sleep over this. You might have to go and sit in your car and scream for a minute. That's okay too. We all have our own coping mechanisms. Just know that the pressure is there for all size institutions to get this right. So it's a good time to do. End of year is always a good time for self-reflection and program reflection. So just, do some kind of thinking through of what you wish, a good post-mortem time too. What could you have done better? What did you learn? What can you quickly implement to help, you don't need to over-engineer your job. You just need to know the risks of your institution and be able to mitigate those risks.
If you are going to scream in the car, I would recommend doing that while you're stopped.
Yes, of course. Technology is changing for bad actors and financial crime fighters alike. So technology is getting better, money moves faster. There's a lot of different spoofing that can happen. There's tons and tons of different things. The bad actors are always going to be multiple steps ahead of what we're mitigating risks for. That's just an unfortunate truth of the industry that we work in. But I would encourage whoever you partner with to help you detect and report suspicious activity, is that you have a true partnership that is there to help you stay informed about what's happening in your area, what's happening as trends, do peer-to-peer comparisons, so that you guys are really truly mitigating and reviewing for risks that are catered to your own institution's offerings, right? Every institution's its own snowflake. You can't have a rinse, repeat software. It really needs to be catered into whatever it is that the risks are to your institution. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at your current vendor. Risk-based is essential. We know that. We've said it a million times. Risk-based approach. And you can't have a proper risk-based approach if you don't do a risk assessment to understand what your risks are. So also remember, I say this every webinar, Appendix J in the FFIEC manual is not a risk assessment. It's not. Don't use that as your risk assessment. If you need a risk assessment template, go to RiskScout.com, or you can email me and I'll hook you up. And also understanding what your strategic plan is at your institution, will help you properly manage your risks, right? The times when I've talked to institutions who've had troubles with regulators, a lot of times it's because they weren't informed of strategic changes that were pertinent for them. And so that looks like it's a systemic, it doesn't just look like it, it is a systemic issue at your institution, and that's where you get trouble, right, Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, regulators love to see some understanding of enterprise risk by the major stakeholders, that being the CFO, BSA officer, chief credit officer, chief risk officer, whoever's really kind of overseeing their respective silos. Getting together and making sure everyone's on the same page is huge.
Excellent. Well said, y'all. That does bring us to our Q&A portion of the webinar, where y'all, the audience, get to ask these lovely experts any questions about today's topics. But before we do dive into those audience questions, we have one final poll question, which you should see popping up on your screen now. And that's just asking if you would like to get in touch with Kristen, with Ryan, with myself, or anyone else here at the RiskScout team. We always love to help out with your BSA AML program. So you can select any of those options, and we'd love to assist you. As a reminder, if you do have any questions that you would like to ask us or ask our experts while we're here on the call, you guys can go ahead and use the questions section of that GoToWebinar panel. And if we don't have any time to answer your question today, or if it's maybe a little bit more complex and we need to go and dive into it offline, we will be sure to follow up with you after today's webinar. Excellent. And I see that we got a couple questions rolling in here. We had one quick question that said, are there any significant changes that we should expect from the new incoming administration? We do sometimes see that with the changing of the guard, there are some changes that happen that might directly impact our roles as, on the BSA team. Kristen, Ryan, do you have a good answer for that? Anything that we should look out for?
You know, I'd say during the previous administration change, you saw a bigger focus on kind of ESG and a lot of the environmental impact that financial institutions can be mitigating. I would imagine that will probably be less important under the upcoming administration, whether we like that or not. And when it comes to just those priorities, that's why the priorities at this in the beginning of the year are going to be so important, because whoever the comptroller is or the different agency heads, they're going to put out basically what's been fed to them from the administration. So you can really get a good idea of what the focus is when you read those priorities, especially in the beginning of a new presidential term. There will certainly be updates on that in our newsletter when they come out.
Excellent. Thank you for that. I know we're almost at time, so let me ask you one last quick final question. And that is, I have had a hard time being included in my bank's 2025 planning, but I'd like to be more involved. Do you have any advice for breaking through that barrier?
Well, I think it's just highly, highly different at every institution, right? I think kind of, Ryan, would you say that documenting the effort of trying to get into those conversations helps from a CYA perspective? Have you seen other institutions where, or how would you advise from a regulator standpoint on how to, I was fortunate, my last institution I worked at took BSA and AML very seriously, and that's because there were previous issues around us at other institutions where that was an issue. So, and unfortunate reality is that sometimes it takes something horrible around you happening for them to care. But Ryan?
I mean, if you wanted to point to guidance, anything enterprise risk related kind of helps to get you a little bit more swaying power, just because you're part of the enterprise and it's impactful information. Some other pieces there, like from the BSA compliance side, there is a lot of information that's valuable to, say, the marketing teams or more revenue forward teams. If you could start to find kind of areas of alignment there, it can provide you some power in negotiation and getting a seat at some of the tables.
One thing I would use too is I often would say, if I couldn't get my team, the upper management, to kind of let me hear what was going on or have a seat at the table, I would get with my regulator, not to tell on them, but just to say, hey, can you help reiterate the message that it's important for me to be included in these conversations? And they had a tactful way of doing it. And then all of a sudden I would be invited to these conversations. And it wasn't that they were bullied into it, but they just needed to hear it from somebody else who wasn't me at that point, just to reiterate the importance and know that I just wasn't trying to be nosy and to things that are happening strategically at the institution. I just need to know so we're protected.
It's so important. I mean, I've told Kristen this story a couple of times, but it's so important to foster connections across silos within your bank or your credit union. And so there was this one bank that I regulated years ago, and they did this initiative where essentially they take one person from each department, and when they had these new projects, those people would come together and kind of create the initial project plan for that. And so doing that, you kind of were able to have people work with different silos within the institution that wouldn't necessarily communicate as much. And when you build those kind of informal relationships, it can just be a better way to building that formal engagement and that formal relationship. But a lot of times it can start in the informal.
Excellent. Well said. Thank you for that. That is all of the time that we have for today. We do want to thank you all for joining us for our last webinar of the year. And of course, a big thank you to both Kristen and Ryan for sharing their expertise with us. Please keep an eye on your inbox, as RiskScout will be sending out the recording, the slides, and the resources from today. Those should hit your inbox tomorrow morning for your convenience. There will also be a brief survey following today's webinar where you can provide us with any feedback on today's session or any webinar requests that you might want to see in 2025. So please take a moment and share your thoughts with us there. If you do have any additional questions, we weren't able to get to your question today during our Q&A, or if you just want to learn more about RiskScout, please come and visit us at riskscout.com. We hope to see you in the new year in a new webinar. And thanks again. Enjoy the rest of your year.
Thanks for joining, everyone.